The afternoon of October 26, 1881, arrived cold in Tombstone, Arizona territory. A stiff wind kicked dust down Fremont Street. At approximately 3 o'clock, 4 men in long black coats walked with purpose past the photography studio of Camilla's Fly. Their boot heels struck the boardwalk in rhythm. Behind them, the silver mines that had birthed this city continued their ceaseless pounding, 3 shifts of immigrant labor hammering ore from the earth at depths now exceeding 500 feet. The 4 lawmen, Deputy U.S. Marshal Virgil Earp, his brothers Morgan and Wyatt, and John Henry Holliday, a tubercular dentist turned gambler, were about to enforce a city ordinance. The ordinance was simple: no deadly weapons within town limits. 6 men waited for them in a vacant lot 15 feet wide, wedged between buildings on Fremont Street. The lot stood 6 doors west of the rear entrance to the OK Corral, though the Corral itself fronted Allen Street and would have nothing to do with what happened next. The waiting men were William Clanton, age 18 or 19 depending on which record you trust, his older brother Ike, and the McLaury brothers, Frank and Tom, along with Billy Claiborne. They had ridden into town that morning after gathering scattered cattle that Apaches had run off from their ranches. Some were armed. The city ordinance said they shouldn't be. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be debated in a courtroom for 30 days, argued in newspapers for decades, and reconstructed in dozens of films over more than a century. Approximately 30 shots were fired. The 2 groups stood roughly 6 feet apart when the shooting started. When the gun smoke cleared, 3 men lay dead or dying: Billy Clanton, Frank McLaury, and Tom McLaury. Virgil Earp took a bullet through his calf. Morgan Earp was shot through both shoulder blades. Doc Holliday caught buckshot or a graze. Accounts differ. Wyatt Earp walked away without a scratch. Ike Clanton, who witnesses said carried no weapon, ran from the lot and lived to file murder charges 4 days later. The myth of this gunfight would eventually eclipse the reality so completely that by 1957, when Hollywood gave it the name we know today, almost no one remembered that the shootout didn't happen at the OK Corral at all, but in a nameless gap between buildings where the wind blew cold and the light fell hard at 3 in the afternoon. This is what the documents tell us happened. This is what the witnesses saw or claimed they saw. This is the 30-second window that opened between 2 versions of the American West. The one that existed in 1881 and the one we've been selling to ourselves ever since. The gunfight was never just about enforcing a weapons ordinance. It was the violent eruption of tensions that had been building for 2 years, driven by the collision of 2 economies, 2 political factions, and 2 visions of who should control a territory that was barely controlled at all. To understand why 4 lawmen walked down Fremont Street that afternoon and why 5 men were waiting for them, you have to understand what Tombstone was in October 1881, a boom town 18 months past its explosive birth, drunk on silver, thick with cash, and splitting along fault lines that had nothing to do with good guys and bad guys. The real story is about money, power, and a fundamental question: who owns the frontier when the frontier is worth a fortune? Here's what matters. In 1881, Tombstone was one of the richest places in the American West, and everyone who lived there knew it wouldn't last. The silver that built the town would eventually drown it. The mines had already struck water at 520 feet that March. Massive Cornish pumps now worked around the clock, pulling out 2.5 million gallons a day at peak capacity. The ore they were bringing up was extraordinary, some of it assayed at $22,000 per ton. But the water was rising. Everyone in Tombstone understood they were racing against both the water table and the price of silver, trying to extract as much wealth as possible before the inevitable collapse. This sense of urgency, of wealth that could vanish overnight, infected every interaction in town. It made everyone desperate. It made everyone dangerous. Ed Schieffelin had discovered the silver in 1877. He'd been prospecting in the hills east of the San Pedro River, despite warnings from soldiers at Fort Huachuca that the only stone he'd find would be his tombstone. Apache warriors led by Cochise, Geronimo, and Victorio controlled the territory. Schieferlin ignored the warnings. When he finally located the vein, he remembered those warnings and filed his claim under the name Tombstone. That vein assayed at $2,000 per ton. He found his brother Al and an assayer named Richard Gerd, and the three men formed a handshake partnership that made them millions. By March 1880, investors from Philadelphia bought the Tombstone Mining and Milling Company, which owned the Goodenough Mine and the Tough Nut Mine. 2 months later, the Tough Nut was working a vein 90 feet across, yielding ore at $170 per ton on average, with spectacular pockets running into the thousands. By the time the Earp brothers arrived on December 1, 1879, Tombstone had exploded from a handful of prospectors to nearly 6,000 residents. Most lived in tents or canvas buildings. The town was raw, provisional, and spectacularly wealthy. On September 9, 1880, the Grand Hotel opened, adorned with oil paintings, Brussels carpets, chandeliers, and a kitchen with hot and cold running water. By 1881, 6,000 miners were pulling ore from the surrounding hills, working 6 10-hour shifts per week at union wages of $4 per day. That's a weekly payroll of $168,000, equivalent to about $5.7 million today, circulating through a population that fluctuated between 6 and 10,000, depending on who was counting and whether they counted Chinese, Mexican, and female residents. That money flowed down Allen Street, which ran 24 hours a day with saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. The town boasted contradictions: 110 liquor licenses active simultaneously, but also 4 churches, a bowling alley, 2 banks, 3 newspapers, an ice house, a school, an opera house, and an ice cream parlor. Telephone service arrived on March 15, 1881. Telegraph service had connected the town in February 1880. The same month, Cochise County was carved from eastern Pima County, and Tombstone became the county seat. A 23-mile pipeline from the Huachuca Mountains brought water to the town in 1881, arriving just as the mine struck the water table and the real problems began. Tombstone was sophisticated and anarchic in equal measure. Visitors marveled at the quality and diversity of goods available. European immigrants worked the mines. Chinese residents handled laundry and provided services. The Cowboys, as they were called, ran the countryside beyond town limits, rustling cattle from haciendas across the international border in Sonora, Mexico, and selling them to the butchers who supplied the town and Fort Huachuca. The Earps arrived at the beginning of this boom. James, Virgil, and Wyatt Earp came to Tombstone together on December 1, 1879, with their common-law wives. Morgan arrived the following summer, in July 1880. They came for the same reason everyone came: to make money. They staked mining claims that went nowhere. Wyatt acquired a 25% interest in a faro game at the Oriental Saloon in return for providing security. James worked as a faro dealer and bartender. Virgil and Morgan found employment guarding stagecoach shipments for Wells Fargo. Virgil also held a commission as Deputy U.S. Marshal for Eastern Pima County, appointed on November 27, 1880, before he arrived in Tombstone. About a half-year later, on July 27, 1880, Wyatt began serving as a deputy sheriff for Pima County under Sheriff Charles Schibel. Virgil Earp became Tombstone's town marshal through a series of accidents and elections. On October 30, 1880, Town Marshal Fred White was accidentally shot and killed by outlaw William Brocius, called Curly Bill. Virgil was appointed acting town marshal. He didn't hold the position long. A special election on November 13th put Ben Sippy in the job, 311 votes to Virgil's 259. Virgil lost again in the regular January 81 election, but Sippy was in financial trouble. He requested a 2-week leave of absence on June 6, 1881, and never returned. The city council once again appointed Virgil as temporary town marshal. On June 22nd, a fire devastated the center section of Tombstone, destroying 66 businesses. Virgil kept looting under control and chased off lot jumpers. On June 28th, when it was learned that Sippy had left about $3,000 in bad debt, Virgil was appointed permanent town marshal at $150 per month. This was a significant position. Town marshal in a city producing millions in silver, with the authority to appoint deputies and enforce local ordinances. In April 1881, the Tombstone City Council had enacted Ordinance No. 9, prohibiting anyone from carrying a deadly weapon within town limits. Everyone was required to deposit their weapons at a livery or saloon soon after entering town. This wasn't unusual for western towns trying to maintain order, but enforcement was always the problem. In Tombstone in 1881, enforcement meant confronting men who had no intention of surrendering their guns and who had friends with political connections. The Cowboys were not an organized gang in the modern sense. They were a loose network of ranchers, rustlers, and outlaws, mostly Democrats with ties to Texas and the Confederacy, who controlled the countryside around Tombstone. The core families were the Clantons and the McLaurys. Newman Haynes Clanton, called Old Man Clanton, ran a ranch near the Mexican border that served as a way station for smuggling and cattle rustling operations. His sons Isaac, called Ike, and William, called Billy, helped run the business. The McLaury brothers, Frank and Tom, owned a ranch outside Tombstone in the Sulphur Springs Valley. They had built a substantial adobe house, a barn, and irrigation ditches, and they owned 8 horses, 2 mules, and 140 head of cattle. Both brothers had studied pre-law. Their older brother William practiced law in Fort Worth, Texas. Frank and Tom were hardly illiterate cowboys. They were educated men who had chosen ranching and, allegedly, the profitable sideline of cattle rustling. The Cowboys' operations had brought them into conflict with the Earps repeatedly. On July 25, 1880, 6 U.S. Army mules were stolen from Camp Rucker. This was a federal matter. Deputy U.S. Marshal Virgil Earp, along with Wyatt, Morgan, and Wells Fargo agent Marshal Williams, tracked the mules to the McLaury Ranch on the Babacomari River. They found the animals and the branding iron used to change the U.S. brand to D8. To avoid bloodshed, a cowboy named Frank Patterson promised to return the mules. Captain Joseph Hurst pressed the posse to withdraw. The Cowboys showed up 2 days later without the mules and laughed at Hurst and the Earps. Hurst responded by printing and distributing a handbill describing the theft and promising a reward. He reproduced this handbill in the Tombstone epitaph on July 30, 1880, specifically naming Frank McLaury as assisting with hiding the mules. When Virgil later encountered Frank McLaury, Frank allegedly said that if Virgil had printed the handbills, it was Frank's intention to kill Virgil. He warned Virgil that if the Earps ever followed them as closely as they had during the mule incident, the Cowboys would have fight. On March 15, 1881, 4 masked men attempted to rob a Kinnear and Company stagecoach carrying $26,000 in silver bullion. The stage was en route from Tombstone to Benson, the nearest rail terminal. During the attempted holdup, the outlaws killed driver Eli Philpott and passenger Peter Roerig. 2 posses went after the robbers, one led by Virgil Earp with Wyatt, Morgan, Bat Masterson, and Doc Holliday, the other led by Cochise County Sheriff Johnny Behan. The Earp posse tracked down Luther King, who confessed to holding horses during the holdup. They turned King over to Behan's custody. King soon escaped from an unlocked jailhouse door. The Earps suspected Behan might have been complicit. The suspects in the robbery were Bill Leonard, Harry Head, and Jim Crane, all cowboys. All 3 would die in unrelated incidents before they could be apprehended. The stagecoach robbery deepened the divide between the Earps and Sheriff Behan. Behan had been appointed Cochise County Sheriff on February 10, 1881, after Cochise County was carved from Pima County. Wyatt Earp had also sought the position. Behan allegedly promised Wyatt a position as his undersheriff if he withdrew from consideration. Wyatt withdrew. Behan was appointed. Behan then reneged on his promise and appointed Harry Woods instead. This betrayal created lasting enmity. It was compounded by the fact that Wyatt began a relationship with Josephine Marcus, an actress who had been Behan's mistress. Wyatt kept his common-law wife, Mattie Blaylock, confined to their home while he courted Josephine openly. This personal animosity mixed toxically with political and economic conflicts. The Cowboys and the Earps represented competing power structures. The Cowboys were Democrats with rural support and connections to Texas. They were sympathetic to the Confederacy in a territory where the Civil War's divisions still mattered. The Earps were Republicans with the backing of Tombstone's business elite, Mayor John Clum, who edited the Tombstone epitaph, mining magnate E.B. Gage, and Reverend Endicott Peabody, the town's Episcopalian minister. This business faction wanted law and order because chaos was bad for profits. The Cowboys wanted minimal interference because their profits came from activities that lawmen like the Earps were tasked with stopping. Sheriff Behan, sympathetic to the Cowboys and politically aligned with their faction, tended to ignore or downplay their criminal activities. The Earps, in contrast, saw the Cowboys as a threat to Tombstone's prosperity and their own positions. By August 1881, the conflict was accelerating. On August 13, 1881, Old Man Clanton and 6 other cowboys were herding stolen cattle through Guadalupe Canyon near the Mexican border when they were ambushed by Mexican soldiers. Old Man Clanton and 4 others were killed. This was retaliation for an earlier ambush in Skeleton Canyon, where 15 Mexicans carrying gold and silver had been killed by cowboys. With Old Man Clanton dead, control of the Cowboys' operations fell to his sons Ike and Billy and to their allies, including the McLaury brothers. Ike Clanton, in particular, was known for being a drunk and a braggart. He was not well liked, even among his own faction. Billy Clanton, on the other hand, was considered level-headed and hard-working. Doc Holliday added a volatile element to the mix. John Henry Holliday had been born in Griffin, Georgia, on August 14, 1851, into a well-to-do family. His mother died of tuberculosis on September 16, 1866, when John was 15. He contracted the disease from her, though it remained latent for years. He enrolled in the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in 1870 and received his Doctor of Dental Surgery degree on March 1, 1872, 5 months before his 21st birthday. The school held his degree until he turned 21, the minimum age to practice. He opened a dental practice in Atlanta, then moved to Dallas, Texas in 1873, seeking a drier climate to ease his symptoms. As his coughing fits worsened, his dental practice declined. He turned to gambling. He was skilled at poker and faro. He was also quick-tempered and proficient with guns and knives. By 1880, Doc Holliday had a reputation. He'd been arrested 17 times before arriving in Tombstone. Most arrests were for assault or gambling violations. Only one was for murder, an 1879 shootout with Mike Gordon in New Mexico, for which he was acquitted. Doc arrived in Tombstone in September 1880. His friendship with Wyatt Earp, which had begun in Texas years earlier, was genuine. Wyatt believed Doc had saved his life during a confrontation in a Texas saloon. Though the details are disputed, Doc was educated, literate, and Southern in his manners when sober. He was also dying slowly and knew it. The tuberculosis gave him a reckless quality. He had less to lose than most men. On the night of October 25, 1881, Ike Clanton spent the evening drinking heavily and playing cards at the Occidental Saloon. The game went late, running until dawn on October 26th. Also at the table were Tom McLaury, Virgil Earp, and Sheriff Johnny Behan, among others. During the game and afterward, Ike made threats against the Earps and Doc Holliday. He was armed with a revolver and a Winchester rifle in violation of the city ordinance. He was loud and public about his intentions. Multiple witnesses heard him say the Earps and Holliday had insulted him the night before when he was unarmed, and now he was armed and intended to shoot them on sight. At about dawn, the card game broke up. Virgil Earp and Sheriff Behan went home to sleep. Ike continued drinking and making threats. Around 1:00 p.m. on October 26th, Virgil and Morgan Earp found Ike on 4th Street. Virgil approached from behind and buffaloed him, pistol-whipping him with his revolver. They disarmed Ike and hauled him before Justice of the Peace Albert Wallace for violating the weapons, ordinance. While Wyatt waited with Ike outside the courtroom, Virgil went to find Judge Wallace. During this wait, Wyatt and Ike had a heated exchange. Witnesses reported that Wyatt told Ike to get his guns and fight, that the confrontation had been coming for a long time. Ike was fined, released, and left the courtroom unarmed. Sometime that morning, Tom McLaury arrived in Tombstone. He was looking for his brother Frank and checking on Ike after hearing about the pistol whipping. On 4th Street, Wyatt encountered Tom and accused him of being armed. Tom opened his coat to show he wasn't carrying a weapon. Wyatt later testified that he saw a pistol in Tom's waistband. Wyatt struck Tom across the head with his revolver, buffaloing him as Virgil had done to Ike. Tom staggered to a nearby doctor to have his wounds treated. By early afternoon, the situation had escalated beyond control. Frank McLaury and Billy Clanton had arrived in town. They met with Ike and Tom, and together with Billy Claiborne, the group moved to the Dexter Corral on Allen Street. From there, they crossed to the OK Corral and walked through to the vacant lot on Fremont Street. Why they went to that lot is unclear. The Cowboys would later claim they were preparing to leave town. The Earps would claim they were positioning themselves for an ambush. What's certain is that several citizens reported to Virgil Earp that the Cowboys were armed and gathered near the OK Corral. Citizens urged Virgil to enforce the weapons ordinance and disarm them. At about 2:30 p.m., Sheriff Behan encountered the Cowboys in the lot on Fremont Street. He later testified that he tried to disarm them but was unsuccessful. Behan claimed he told the Cowboys to give up their guns, and they refused. He then claimed he went looking for Virgil Earp to warn him, but met Virgil, Wyatt, Morgan, and Doc Holliday already walking toward the lot. Behan said he told Virgil, "I have been down there to disarm them." Whether Behan actually said this, or whether Virgil heard it, would become crucial to the legal case that followed. The four lawmen walked down Fremont Street toward the lot. Virgil carried a cane in his right hand. He'd taken a shotgun from the Wells Fargo office, but given it to Doc Holliday, who carried it under his long coat. Virgil wanted his hands free to signal that he came to parley, not to fight. The shotgun was a precaution. Morgan and Wyatt both carried revolvers, as did Doc, who also had the shotgun. The Cowboys in the lot were Frank McLaury, Tom McLaury, Billy Clanton, Ike Clanton, and Billy Claiborne. The question of who was armed among the Cowboys would be fiercely contested. Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury were definitely armed. Witnesses disagreed about whether Tom McLaury carried a weapon. Ike Clanton was unarmed. Claiborne's status is unclear. The two groups faced each other across roughly 6 feet. That distance is extraordinarily close for a gunfight. At 6 feet, you can read a jama'a, man's expression. You can see sweat. The vacant lot was about 15 feet wide, hemmed in by buildings. There was nowhere to run except back toward Fremont Street or deeper into the alley. Witnesses positioned themselves in windows, doorways, and on the street. Some later claimed to have perfect views. Others admitted they saw only fragments. Many changed their stories over time or contradicted themselves. Reconstructing the sequence of shots is impossible with certainty. What's clear is this. Virgil raised his cane and shouted something. Accounts differ on what he said. Some witnesses claimed he yelled, "Throw up your hands! I want your guns!" Others heard, "Boys, throw up your hands. I don't mean that. I have come to disarm you." Still others remembered different words. Virgil's intent seems to have been to call for surrender, not to initiate combat. But the Cowboys didn't throw up their hands. Whether this was refusal or whether they were already going for their guns is unclear. Within seconds, the first shots were fired. Who fired first? This question consumed the preliminary hearing. Testimony conflicted wildly. Some witnesses said Wyatt and Billy Clanton fired simultaneously. Others claimed Doc Holliday and Morgan Earp fired across each other at the McLaurys and Billy Clanton. Still others insisted the Cowboys drew first. What's certain is that once the shooting started, it didn't stop until 30 rounds had been fired and 30 seconds had passed. Tom McLaury was hit by a shotgun blast. Whether he was armed is disputed. After his death, no gun was found on his body or near it. Wyatt Earp later insisted that someone had removed Tom's weapon and that the Cowboys lied during testimony. Tom's death was attributed to Doc Holliday, who was the only man carrying a shotgun. Frank McLaury was shot in the stomach and then in the head. He died in the street. Billy Clanton was shot in the chest and the right arm. His right arm was shattered, forcing him to switch his revolver to his left hand and continue firing. He died 30 minutes after the fight ended. On the lawmen's side, Virgil Earp was shot through the calf. He believed Billy Clanton shot him. Morgan Earp was shot through both shoulder blades. The bullet entered his back and exited through his chest. Doc Holliday took a wound, though whether it was a bullet graze or buckshot is unclear. Wyatt Earp, standing in the most exposed position, was not hit. This fact would later contribute to his mystique. A man who walks through a gunfight unscathed becomes legendary. Ike Clanton, unarmed, fled at the start of the shooting. He ran into Fly's boarding house, then out the back door. Billy Claiborne also fled. Sheriff Bean attempted to arrest Wyatt and Doc immediately after the shooting. Wyatt refused. "I won't be arrested," he said, and accused Bean of lying about disarming the Cowboys. Citizens stepped forward to defend the Earps, saying they had acted correctly. The dead Cowboys were laid out for viewing. About 300 people followed the funeral cortege on October 27th, and approximately 2,000 lined the route to Boot Hill Cemetery. The Tombstone epitaph ran the headline, "3 men hurled into eternity in the duration of a moment." The funerals were the largest Tombstone had ever seen. Billy Clanton and the McLaury brothers were buried in Boot Hill. The town divided sharply. Many supported the Earps, believing they'd enforce the law against armed outlaws. Others believed the Earps had committed murder. On October 27th, a coroner's inquest convened. The jury stated facts, but made no determination about whether the killings were justifiable. The verdict read, William Clanton, Frank and Thomas McLaury came to their deaths in the town of Tombstone on October 26, 1881, from the effects of pistol and gunshot wounds inflicted by Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp, Wyatt Earp, and one Holliday, commonly called Doc Holliday. This neutral phrasing satisfied no one. On October 30th, 4 days after the shootout, Ike Clanton filed first-degree murder charges against Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, and John Holliday. A preliminary hearing began on November the 1st, presided over by Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer. The purpose was to determine if enough evidence existed to hold the defendants for trial. But both prosecution and defense treated it as a full trial, presenting complete cases with dozens of witnesses. Defense attorney Thomas Fitch was one of the most experienced criminal lawyers in the region. Judge Spicer was a Republican with mutual friends among the Earps. The defense strategy was to win at the preliminary hearing in front of Spicer, rather than risk a jury trial that might include Cowboy sympathizers. Wyatt and Doc Holliday were arrested and held in jail. Bail was set at $10,000 each, a substantial sum. Contributions came from E.B. Gage, the mining superintendent, Wells Fargo undercover agent Fred Dodge, and local business owners who appreciated the Earps' efforts to maintain order. Wyatt contributed $7,000 toward Doc's bail. Morgan and Virgil, still recovering from their wounds, were allowed to remain free but under house arrest. The city council suspended Virgil as town marshal pending the outcome of the hearing. The hearing lasted 30 days. Ike Clanton testified that the Earps had ambushed the Cowboys, that Tom McLaury had opened his coat to show he was unarmed, and that the Cowboys had raised their hands in surrender before the shooting started. He claimed Wyatt had shoved a revolver into his belly and said, "You son of a bitch, you can have a fight." Billy Claiborne supported Ike's version. Sheriff Bean testified that he had disarmed the Cowboys, or attempted to, and had warned the Earps that he'd already handled the situation. He claimed Doc Holliday and Morgan Earp fired the first shots. The defense presented a different narrative. Multiple witnesses testified that they'd heard Ike Clanton making threats against the Earps throughout the morning of October 26th. H.F. Sills, an engineer visiting Tombstone, testified that he'd overheard Cowboys passing through the OK Corral saying they would kill the Earps. Sills had no connection to any party and had arrived in town only the day before. His testimony carried weight precisely because he had no stake in the outcome. Other witnesses testified that the Cowboys had refused to disarm, that Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury had drawn their weapons first, and that Virgil had shouted a warning before any shots were fired. Wyatt testified that he and Billy Clanton fired the first 2 shots simultaneously, that he'd seen weapons in the Cowboys' hands, and that he'd believed his life was in danger. On November 7th, 8 days into the hearing, Judge Spicer revoked bail for Wyatt and Doc and ordered them jailed. This decision came after pressure from prosecutor Littleton Price and from William McLaury, who had arrived from Fort Worth to push for his brother's killers to be imprisoned. Wyatt and Doc spent several days in jail before bail was reinstated. The Earps moved their families into the Cosmopolitan Hotel for mutual protection. Threats arrived daily. On November 30th, 1881, Judge Spicer issued his ruling. He found that Virgil Earp had acted lawfully as a peace officer attempting to disarm men who were violating a city ordinance. Spicer wrote, "In view of all the facts and circumstances of the case, considering the threats made, the character and positions of the parties, and the tragic results accomplished in manner and form as they were, with all surrounding influences bearing upon the res geste of the affair, I cannot resist the conclusion that the defendants were fully justified in committing these homicides." The Earps and Holliday were free, but freedom didn't mean safety. On December 14th, someone tried to kill Mayor John Clum, who published the Tombstone epitaph and had supported the Earps editorially. While on a stagecoach to Benson, unknown assailants fired on the stage. Clum was convinced they were trying to kill him. The same day, Judge Spicer received a threatening letter signed "A Minor," telling him to leave Tombstone or be killed. Spicer published a defiant response in the epitaph, stating he would not bow to threats. On December 28, 1881, exactly 8 weeks after the gunfight, Virgil Earp was ambushed. At about 11:30 p.m., as he walked from the Oriental Saloon back to the Cosmopolitan Hotel, 3 men with shotguns fired at him from an unfinished building across Allen Street. Virgil was hit by 3 loads of buckshot from about 60 feet. The blasts struck him in the back and left arm. About 19 buckshot pellets also hit the Crystal Palace Saloon and the Eagle Brewery, passing through windows and narrowly missing patrons. Virgil didn't fall. He staggered into the hotel, critically wounded. Doctors removed 4 inches of shattered bone from his left arm. The arm would be permanently crippled, useless for the rest of his life. When examined by doctors, Virgil managed to tell his wife Allie, "Never mind, I've got 1 arm left to hug you with." Ike Clanton's hat was found in the building where the shots were fired, but no one was ever charged. Witnesses provided alibis for the suspects. U.S. Marshal Crawley Dake appointed Wyatt as Deputy U.S. Marshal to replace the wounded Virgil. Wyatt began deputizing a federal posse. The Earps believed they knew who was responsible for the ambush, but the legal system wasn't going to deliver justice. On March 18, 1882, Morgan Earp was assassinated. That evening, Morgan, Doc Holliday, and Dan Tipton attended a play at Schieffelin Hall. Wyatt had warned against going, having received threats earlier that day. After the play, Doc went to his room. Morgan and Tipton headed to Campbell and Hatch's billiard parlor on Allen Street. At about 10:50 p.m., Morgan was playing billiards with Bob Hatch. Wyatt sat watching along with Dan Tipton and Sherman McMaster. 2 shots were fired through a glass window in the back door, which opened onto an alley. The first bullet hit Morgan in the back near the spine. It passed through his body, completely shattering his spinal column, and exited on the left side. The bullet continued across the room and lodged in the thigh of George Berry, who was standing by the stove. The second shot passed across the room and struck the wall near the ceiling, close to where Wyatt was sitting. Morgan fell instantly. He was carried into the adjacent card room. He lived about an hour. According to Wyatt Earp biographer Stuart Lake, Wyatt and Morgan had occasionally discussed deathbed visions. As Morgan died, he whispered to Wyatt, "I can't see a damn thing." Morgan died just after midnight on March 19th, which was Wyatt's 34th birthday. He was 30 years old. Pete Spence's wife, Marietta Duarte, testified at a coroner's inquest that she'd seen Pete Spence, Frank Stillwell, a man named Frice, and 2 Indian half-breeds leaving her home around the time of the shooting. One was called Indian Charlie. The other's name was unknown. During a preliminary hearing, the defense objected to Duarte's testimony as hearsay, and because a spouse couldn't testify against a husband. The judge agreed. The charges were dismissed. Once again, the legal system failed to deliver justice. Wyatt Earp decided to take matters into his own hands. On March 20th, Virgil left Tombstone under heavy guard, accompanying Morgan's body to the Earp family home in Colton, California, for burial. The funeral cortege left the Cosmopolitan Hotel around 12:30 p.m., with the fire bell tolling. Wyatt assembled a federal posse that included his brother Warren, Doc Holliday, Sherman McMaster, Turkey Creek Jack Johnson, and Texas Jack Vermillion. They were deputized as federal marshals. Their mission was officially to arrest the men responsible for the attacks on Virgil and Morgan. In practice, it was a vendetta. That same day, March 20th, Wyatt's posse found Frank Stillwell at the train station in Tucson. Stillwell was allegedly waiting to ambush the Earps when they arrived with Morgan's body. Instead, Wyatt and his men cornered Stillwell. He was shot multiple times at close range and left dead by the tracks. The posse then tracked down and killed Florentino Cruz, called Indian Charlie, who had been identified by Pete Spence's wife. On March 24th, at Iron Springs, the posse encountered Curly Bill Brocius and several other cowboys. In the gunfight that followed, Wyatt killed Curly Bill with a shotgun blast. Johnny Barnes was also shot and died soon after. The Earps spent the next week scouring southern Arizona for more suspects. They killed at least 4 men. Sheriff Behan organized a posse to arrest Wyatt for murder, but Behan never caught up with them. By late April, Wyatt and his men left Arizona Territory for Colorado. They were never prosecuted for the killings. The Earp vendetta ride was over. The immediate aftermath of the gunfight and the vendetta ride left Tombstone bitterly divided. Those who supported the Earps saw them as lawmen who'd enforced the weapons ordinance against armed outlaws and then delivered justice when the courts failed. Those who supported the Cowboys saw the Earps as power-hungry killers who'd executed men in the street and then murdered more in a campaign of revenge. Both narratives were partly true. The reality was that the Earps had acted as lawmen in a situation where the legal system was inadequate. They'd enforced a weapons ordinance against men who were probably preparing to ambush them. Then, when 2 of them were shot and 1 killed by men who escaped prosecution, they'd use their federal authority to hunt down and kill the suspects. The gunfight at the OK Corral, as it would eventually be called, wasn't anomalous. Tombstone in 1881 recorded numerous shootings and killings. Boot Hill Cemetery filled with men who died violently. What made the October 26th gunfight different was the political dimension. This wasn't random violence. It was a confrontation between two organized factions fighting for control of a wealthy territory. The fact that it happened in broad daylight on a main street with dozens of witnesses made it a public spectacle. The 30-day preliminary hearing turned it into a legal and political drama. The subsequent assassinations and vendetta ride turned it into a blood feud that captivated newspapers across the country. But the event wasn't famous immediately. Coverage in 1881 was extensive in Arizona and in some national newspapers, but the story faded. The Earps left Arizona. Virgil recovered partially and worked as a lawman in California and Nevada until his death in 1905. Wyatt drifted through boom towns, working as a saloon keeper, gambler, and occasional lawman. He settled in California with Josephine Marcus. Doc Holliday moved to Colorado, where his tuberculosis worsened. He died in Glenwood Springs on November 8, 1887, at age 36. His last words were reportedly, "This is funny." He'd expected to die in a gunfight, not in a bed. The transformation of the gunfight into legend began in 1931, 2 years after Wyatt Earp's death. Stuart Lake, a former press agent and Hollywood writer, published Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. Lake had interviewed Wyatt near the end of his life and claimed to base the book on those interviews. The book portrayed Wyatt as a fearless lawman who brought order to Kansas cow towns and then faced down savage rustlers in Tombstone. It was largely fiction. Lake later admitted that many of the quotations attributed to Wyatt were invented. The book exaggerated Wyatt's role while downplaying Virgil's, even though Virgil was the town marshal and the ranking lawman at the gunfight. But the book became a bestseller during the Great Depression. Americans searching for heroes found one in Wyatt Earp. Hollywood seized on the story. The 1939 film Frontier Marshal, starring Randolph Scott, was based loosely on Lake's book. John Ford's 1946 film My Darling Clementine, with Henry Fonda as Wyatt Earp, turned the story into American myth. Then came the 1957 film Gunfight at the OK Corral, directed by John Sturges and starring Burt Lancaster as Wyatt and Kirk Douglas as Doc Holliday. This film gave the shootout the name by which it's known today. Before 1957, historians called it the Fremont Street Fight or the gunfight near the OK Corral. But Gunfight at the OK Corral sounded better. It was marketing genius. The film was a huge hit, earning millions and cementing the event in popular consciousness. The fact that the gunfight didn't happen at the OK Corral didn't matter. The name stuck. Television amplified the legend. The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp, starring Hugh O'Brien, ran from 1955 to 1961. It portrayed Wyatt as a crusading lawman cleaning up the frontier. The show ran for 6 seasons and 229 episodes, reaching millions of viewers. By the 1960s, Wyatt Earp was one of the most famous figures in American history, recognized even by people who knew nothing about the actual events in Tombstone. The legend has been revised and challenged repeatedly. The 1967 film Hour of the Gun, also directed by John Sturges, began with a more accurate depiction of the gunfight and then covered the vendetta ride. It portrayed the Earps as morally ambiguous. The 1993 film Tombstone, with Kurt Russell as Wyatt and Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday, leaned into the myth while acknowledging complexities. The 1994 film Wyatt Earp, with Kevin Costner, attempted a more historical approach but was less successful at the box office. Each generation has remade the story in its own image, emphasizing different aspects. Sometimes the Earps are heroes, sometimes they're anti-heroes. Sometimes the focus is on the gunfight itself, sometimes it's on the vendetta or the friendship between Wyatt and Doc. What the historical record actually supports is less dramatic than the legend, but more interesting. The gunfight at the OK Corral was the violent climax of a struggle between two factions in a boom town where enormous wealth was at stake and the legal system was inadequate. The Earps were lawmen. but they were also businessmen with economic interests to protect. The Cowboys were outlaws, but they were also ranchers and small businessmen with their own economic interests. The conflict was about power. Who controlled Tombstone's streets? Who controlled the countryside? Who controlled access to wealth? The weapons ordinance was the pretext. The real issue was control. The 30 seconds on Fremont Street didn't resolve anything. 3 men died, but the conflict continued for months afterward. Virgil was crippled. Morgan was killed. The Earps left Arizona, never to return. Sheriff Bean wasn't renominated by his own party in 1882 and never again worked as a lawman. Ike Clanton survived until 1887, when he was shot and killed by a detective in a gunfight near Springerville, Arizona. He was 40 years old. Johnny Ringo was found dead on July 14, 1882, with a gunshot through the temple, likely a suicide. Pete Spence survived and was later imprisoned for other crimes. Tombstone's silver boom collapsed in the late 1880s when the mines flooded and the price of silver dropped. The pumps failed. The water rose. By 1893, all silver production had ceased. Tombstone's population dwindled to 646 by 1910. The town survived because it was the Cochise County seat until 1929. When that designation moved to Bisbee, Tombstone nearly died. It was saved by tourism. In the 1930s, a book about the gunfight was published. More books and films followed. Tombstone embraced its past. The OK Corral became a tourist attraction. Boot Hill was preserved. Buildings from the 1880s were restored. The town began staging daily reenactments of the gunfight. By the 1960s, Tombstone's primary industry was nostalgia. About 500,000 visitors come to Tombstone each year now, drawn by the legend of 30 seconds that happened one cold October afternoon in 1881. The myth persists because it's compelling. 4 lawmen walking toward 5 outlaws, the moment of confrontation, 30 shots in 30 seconds, 3 men dead. Justice delivered at gunpoint. It fits the American narrative about the frontier. Civilization versus savagery, law versus outlaw, good versus evil. The reality was messier. The Earps weren't perfectly heroic. The Cowboys weren't purely villainous. Everyone involved had motives that mixed self-interest with principle. Everyone was trying to survive in a place where the rules were unclear and the stakes were high. The documents tell us what happened, within limits. We know approximately where each man stood. We know who was shot and where the bullets entered. We know what witnesses claimed to have seen, though we also know they contradicted each other and themselves. We know the legal proceedings and their outcomes. We know who died and when. What we can't know with certainty is who fired first, who was justified, and what was in the minds of the men involved. Those questions will never be settled. Every attempt to reconstruct the event requires choosing which witnesses to believe and which motives to assign to which actions. What's clear is that the gunfight mattered at the time because it was a flashpoint in a larger conflict, and it matters now because it became a symbol. The symbol has evolved. In the 1930s, it was about heroic lawmen taming the frontier. In the 1960s, it was about the violence underlying American expansion. In the 1990s, it was about moral ambiguity and the cost of vengeance. The event itself doesn't change. The facts remain the same. But what the facts mean shifts with each generation's concerns. On October 26, 1881, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in a vacant lot 6 doors west of the OK Corral's rear entrance, 4 lawmen and 5 cowboys faced each other across 6 feet of dirt. 30 seconds later, 3 men were dead or dying, 3 were wounded, and 2 had fled. The survivors would live with what happened for the rest of their lives. Some would die because of it. Others would spend decades answering questions about it, reliving it, defending it, or profiting from it. None of them could have known that the 30 seconds they lived through would be reenacted thousands of times, that their names would be known by millions, that the vacant lot where they stood would become one of the most famous locations in American history. The gunfight at the OK Corral is a fixed point in history, documented and debated, mythologized and marketed. It's also a reminder that history is made by people making decisions in moments of extreme pressure, with incomplete information and conflicting interests, and that how we remember those moments says as much about us as it does about them. The afternoon of October 26, 1881, was cold in Tombstone. The wind kicked dust down Fremont Street. 4 men in long black coats walked toward a vacant lot. What happened next took 30 seconds. We've been arguing about it for more than 140 years.